The core of anarchist politics is a desire for human flourishing and freedom in all aspects of life. That the modern anarchist movement concerns itself not just with the abolition of capitalism and the state, but also other systems of oppression, such as patriarchy, queerphobia, white supremacy, and ableism, is a natural development of this idea. To make an anarchist case for autism acceptance under the broader umbrella of disability politics is to contribute further to this natural development. We live in a neurotypical-centric society. What does that mean? Well, neurotypical, or NT for short, refers to people with typical neural development. If a society is NT-centric, it accommodates for the needs of people with typical neural development, NTs. Meanwhile, neurodivergent people, such as autistic people, people with dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, and so on, are expected to adjust themselves accordingly to that society, which is not designed to meet their needs. While neurodivergent as a category refers to much more than just autistic people, hence neurodiversity. In this video, I'd like to talk about the experience of an NT-centric society from an autistic perspective, because that's what I'm more knowledgeable about, and what's true for the autistic experience isn't necessarily true for the others. Given its design for neurotypicals, the NT-centric society does not accommodate for autistic people's needs. To preserve that social order, the suffering of autistic people is blamed not on the poorly accommodating society, but the inherent properties of autism itself. The idea that you suffer from autism is used to detract from your suffering at the hands of society. Thus, autism has to be treated as a disease to be cured, and autistic people are obliged to adjust to the society by treating autism in this manner. This requirement of the autistic individual to accommodate to the NT-centric society can be seen in numerous ways. One example is the use of functioning labels, which indicate the extent to which an autistic person's externally visible traits appear neurotypical. The more neurotypical you seem, the higher functioning you are. There are a number of problems with this. One is that the autistic experience is not necessarily externally visible. Sometimes we might present the same external traits as an NT, but through entirely different cognitive processes. For example, an autistic person might make eye contact with people, but through conscious thought. I'm socializing, so I've got to make eye contact with this person. Whereas an NT just does this automatically. So the appearance of eye contact doesn't indicate lack of an autistic experience. Functioning labels based on superficial traits therefore mask the additional support needs that a so-called high-functioning individual might have, and detract from the valuable capacities that a so-called low-functioning individual might have. Another problem with functioning labels is that, as well as being superficial, they present neurotypical traits as the ideal of functioning, and autistic traits as less than ideal. When NTs try to compliment autistic people by saying things like, "But your social skills are great. You seem really normal. You must be very high functioning. Don't be so hard on yourself. You're not autistic," all of which are typically accompanied by a patronising pat on the head. They may not realise that this is actually destructive to autistic people. Complimenting us on the ability to hide autistic traits carries the implicit assumption that our traits are less than ideal and ought to be erased. It negates the idea of autism as a valid component of one's self-identity, the idea that actually makes autistic people happy. Another example of NT-centric ideology is desexualization of autistic people. We're often stereotyped to simply not have desires for friendship, sex, and relationships, and meeting these needs is perceived by the society as some kind of an overcoming of autistic traits. You're not autistic, you can build friendships and relationships, have sex, and so on, as if being autistic and meeting these needs are mutually exclusive. Asexuality is of course an entirely valid sexual identity, but the assumption that autistic people are somehow asexual by default is a common stereotype of our society. The failure of the society to accommodate for our perspective on the world accounts for our difficulties socializing to a significant extent. NTs aren't taught how to interact with us appropriately. Instead, the burden is placed on us to learn to interact with them, despite the fact that social interaction is far more cognitively taxing for us than it is for them. And if we fail to treat core aspects of our self-identity and way of life as a problem to be solved as the society does, then the society will blame us for our suffering. We've been told to think that there's something wrong with us, and we can experience negative mental health outcomes, such as anxiety and depression, as a result of this, because the values of the society become a part of our self-talk. We might ask ourselves questions like, why do other people make negative comments when I share my interests in particular subjects? What's wrong with me? How come I don't feel good in noisy and crowded environments? Why am I like this? What's wrong with me? If I can't fix myself, then the difficulties I'm having in my life are my fault. This self-talk means that the ordinary, small difficulties of autistic living can become inflated into something much greater. It's one thing to have sensory overload. It's quite another to make a leap and start assuming that there's something inherently wrong with you for having it. It's one thing for us to have difficulties socializing. Blaming ourselves for this is quite another. This causes us an enormous amount of preventable suffering because we're constantly judging whether our behaviour is meeting the standards of the NT-centric society rather than just letting our autistic side be what it is. But what if there isn't anything wrong with being autistic? What if it's actually okay to stop treating autistic people as problems that need to be solved? Herein lies the value of autism acceptance. We dismantle the notion that being autistic is a problem and instead accept autism as a necessary but not sufficient component of our self-identities as people. This shift has a number of advantages. Firstly, it allows us to say, I'm autistic, but I'm not just autistic. Without being autistic, we wouldn't be ourselves, but the diagnosis doesn't define everything about us. In conversations with neurotypical people, some of us will no doubt have had the experience of briefly disclosing being autistic for reasons of accessibility with the intention of returning to talking about our various day-to-day interests, only to then find NTs hijack the rest of the conversation into an incredibly boring exchange about how psychologically interesting we are to them as they proceed to make vacuous observations about every last bit of our speech and behaviour. Ah yes, you're autistic. Let me tell you all about what that means, as if I know more about your experience than you. Accepting autism as a necessary but not sufficient component of our identities helps us to treat ourselves as human beings and get round these problems of being essentialised. It's just one of multiple factors determining how we act in our day-to-day lives, and believe it or not, most of us just want to get on with things. Secondly, autism acceptance allows us to stop constantly trying to fix ourselves and what we're feeling in order to meet the neurotypical criteria, because we recognise that our way of being is actually legitimate. That lifts a huge burden, because the difficulties of being autistic remain as just that, difficulties, instead of catapulting us into negative self-talk. It's important to recognise that autism and social anxiety are not the same thing, but as we're taught to treat our social skills as something to be fixed, we can end up being socially anxious as a result, constantly monitoring our behaviour, which makes socialising more difficult. It's ironic that by trying to fix autistic people, our society makes it more difficult for us to fit in, even though it wrongly treats fitting in as some kind of desired state. Rather than seeking to erase autism, NTs have to accept and learn how to interact with us, and on our terms. If you want to interact with an autistic person appropriately, just ask them what their needs are. They might want you to, for example, speak in a more literal fashion so that it's easier to understand what you're saying. They might want you to flag up when you're being dry or sarcastic. They might just want you to be aware that their volumes and tones of voice don't necessarily reflect anything about their thoughts on the conversation. These are common things, but importantly, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, hence the appropriateness of asking the individual. This should apply in workplaces and communities too, which should adjust for autistic people rather than putting us through a process of self-negation. And of course, an NT might respond to this by complaining, "Why should I have to learn how to interact with autistic people on their terms? That's not fair on me." NTs demand us to change fundamental aspects of ourselves for their benefit, but if we ask them to simply accept and accommodate for our way of life, then according to them, we're being unreasonable. The value of an anarchist slant on autism acceptance is that it provides a means of understanding the interactions between the NT-centric society and other oppressive systems such as patriarchy. For example, an autistic girl might be bullied for having a special interest in listing facts about the moons of Jupiter, and an autistic boy might be bullied for not wanting to play football. The bullying happens not just because of the marginalisation of autistic people, but also because of patriarchal stereotypes, which assume that girls shouldn't be interested in space and science, and that boys have to like football. Autistic trans people may have more difficulty getting their gender identities recognised and taken seriously, as the transphobic society can use their autistic status as a means of explaining away their desire to transition, despite the fact that autism and gender identity are entirely independent things. It should be briefly noted here that the notion that autistic people have extreme male brains, promoted by Simon Baron-Cohen, really falls short here. It lies on extraordinary, biased claims about the essential nature of gender identities. It completely erases the existence of autistic women and non-binary people, and it ignores the fact that understanding patriarchal gender norms contributes to a fuller understanding of the autistic experience. Another example is capitalism. In the workplace, when reasonable adjustments aren't made in order to accommodate for autistic people's social and sensory needs, the causes of that oppression are both the NT-centric society, which assumes that these particular needs are illegitimate and need to be fixed, and the capitalist work structure, which puts bosses' profits before the needs of workers. Understanding how NT-centric society treats autistic people as a problem to be solved is necessary to understand how autistic workers experience capitalism. It's also no surprise that many autistic people have been mistreated by the police. A study at the University of Bath found that 69% of autistic people interviewed were unhappy with the way that they were treated by the police due to fears of being discriminated against, lack of clarity in explaining what was happening to them, loud sirens, flashing lights, assuming dishonesty from lack of eye contact, and so on. Thus, people of colour who are frequently targeted by the white supremacist police are going to have even more horrific experiences if they're autistic. The institutional functions of the police force to protect systems of oppression through physical aggression and intimidation render it an inherently anti-autistic institution. Some might call for more compassionate policing, but this notion is simply a farce when the police aren't designed to see the population as human. If you want to make the police accessible for autistic people, just get rid of them. As we can see, an anarchist perspective allows us to understand how different systems of oppression interact to produce these multifaceted events. As autistic people, we aren't just systematically mistreated from living in an NT-centric society, but also from living under systems such as capitalism, patriarchy, the state, white supremacy, transphobia, and so on. This is why anarchism and autism acceptance go hand in hand, because anarchism gives us a means of understanding all of these systems of oppression together. Or at least they should go hand in hand by basic standards of consistency. This has been Libertarian Socialist Rants. Thanks for watching this video, and thank you to my supporters on Patreon. Aikske, I've no idea if I pronounced that correctly. Brandon Haukus Tischer, no idea about that either. Daniel Vincent Chilton, Iblis Rising, Ja Creature, Julius Nyborg Olsen, Kurt von Ohlen, Marty, Oklahoma People's Alliance, Patrick Gordon, Piss Ghost, Sam Caesar, and Triple X Swagmaster, and all of my other contributors too. Your support is much appreciated. I do apologise sincerely for the lateness of this video, as I ended up having a brief downturn in my mental health. It was very, very unexpected, but not for no reason. The heart of the matter is that I'd just become aware of some upsetting issues that I hadn't shed light on before, and that was a bit of a shock to the system. It happens. In my next video, I'd like to talk about the political side of the difficulties I've been dealing with, because I can imagine a lot of young men particularly are likely to be going through a similar sort of thing, and I'm hopeful that what I have to say will resonate with people. See you soon.